Last night I came across this bill, introduced bill called H.R. 3498, or the Human Cloning Prohibition Act of 2105. It was introduced by the Representative Andy Harris on 9/11/2015, so not too long ago, to amend Title 18 United States Code to prohibit human cloning. And here is like the bill. I printed it out, and I'm going to go over their findings and what they are proposing or introducing inside of this bill for the future, or around the lines that they are thinking. Section number 2 shows the findings. Congress finds that some individuals have announced that they will continue attempts to clone human beings using the technique known as somatic cell nuclear transfer, or stem cells, already used with limited success in cloning sheep and other animals. I'm pretty sure a cat was cloned. Then on part 14 of this bill, they actually mention that cloned human embryos have been created in a few cases to be destroyed to extract embryonic stem cells, I guess for medical advances. These few successes substantially increase the risk for exploitation of women for human eggs needed to create clones, and continued experimentation makes it more likely that there will be attempts to gestate cloned human embryos to birth. Nearly all scientists agree that such attempts pose a massive risk, producing children who are stillborn, unhealthy, they may have birth defects, or are severely disabled, and it is considered an virtually unanimous opinion across the board, supposedly, that such attempts are therefore grossly irresponsible and unethical. The issue with this is, in my opinion, that it's already happening. You think about the first thing that comes to mind is IVF, in vitro fertilization, because of infertility or somebody having genetic issues, and them, taking some type of online DNA test or genetic test, and then that helping them push them into the direction of in vitro fertilization. The same goes for potentially this infertility and genetic problems being caused by a previous government agenda of like spraying poisons or prescribing certain medications that may prevent pregnancy or make it harder in the future, or even contaminating the food or water supply to make it harder to get pregnant. But clearly in vitro fertilization is already happening, so calling it grossly irresponsible and unethical, that seems kind of wrong in a sense, because otherwise that should not be allowed either, because you are using a sperm and an egg, and you are putting them together in a little petri dish. You're letting them grow, and when they're ready to be implanted into the woman or the womb, that's when I guess it is considered life, though they say. But what happens when they one day create artificial wombs, for example, since they're creating, organs and other such tissues out of stem cells, and eventually were to be able to create, little wombs that could house such embryos without the need of a woman, hence the term men having babies and all that stuff coming up quite often. Efforts to create human beings by cloning mark a new decisive step towards turning human reproduction into a manufacturing process in which children are made in laboratories to preordained specifications and potentially in multiple copies. So there's several things that come into play. Many people right now during this time are giving up their sperms and their eggs to many of these banks, correct? And these banks can hold on to them. How do you, as the individual, know if they're using one of your sperms or eggs? Secretly, are you honestly counting them every time? And technically you are giving the facility, permission to house them, to take care of them, and to use them. So they could technically, I guess, use sperms or eggs that have been stored eventually in the future for such purposes to create clones or multiple copies or even babies. And I'm assuming the cloning mark is, and when they mention the cloning mark, the first thing that comes to mind is the mark of the beast, as they say. Or also this cloning movie, I don't know the name, but inside of it, every time they get cloned, they get a little dot underneath their eyelid to help identify them. And it is important to be able to identify them, because they can't only just take your DNA through sperm and egg like banks, or you giving them permission to do this. They could technically also retrieve your DNA if you go to a doctor and they take just a simple sample, like a blood sample or something, and in that moment you are giving up your consent, and it can be used for whatever purpose. And what if they happen to make a clone out of you, and then there's you and then your clone out there? How do you identify the original person who gave the DNA from the clone? And this is important because technically one could argue that a clone is considered a second-class citizen, which means that it may or may not have the potential of being destroyed. And let's just say you're someone political or famous or something like this, or just even somebody random, it doesn't really matter, and they can use this to their advantage. They can make a clone out of you, but then kill the original, and then tweak the clone to their needs, and just have a copy ready, if really needed be. And we'll get further into that into the video. Because it is an asexual form of reproduction, cloning confounds the meaning of father and mother and confuses identity and kinship relations of any cloned child, and thus threatens to weaken existing notions regarding who bears which parental duties and responsibilities for the children. Is it the person who donated the sperm or the egg, or the parents paying for it? In some cases, will it be the government if they're doing it in their lab for like creating an army out of clones or something? And what if they use your sperm and egg or DNA? Then you have no say-so, and you might not even be considered the mother or the father. And at any point in time, they may or may not take it away. If for some reason these laws that they're trying to put into effect or write or propose slightly change or come into fruition, there's many various ways this can happen. If they eventually try to take the kids away and control the clones too much, I believe that'll be the beginning of the Clone Wars, or like World War III in a sense. because the people and the clones will become more aware, and they will get tired of it, and they will not want their children taken away, or the clones start becoming conscious and moral of what's going on, and they don't like that, and they don't want to be killed or something, or be part of this army. You never know what various paths might open up if this continues. We just have to be prepared for all contingencies. Because cloning requires no personal involvement by the person whose genetic material is used, cloning could easily be used to reproduce living or deceased persons with or without their consent. The first thing that comes to mind is any DNA collecting agencies, whether it is for checking your DNA, your where you come from, your history, or checking for any genetic abnormalities, including just simple doctor samples and specimens. Like if you were to go to a doctor, they collect some blood or a stool sample, and then they can do whatever with it, because it's not part of your person anymore. You gave consent to give it to the doctor to have get tested. It's kind of like the Helena cells from around the World War time, where this lady, she had cervical cancer, and they scraped some of her cervix and have kept the cells alive since. And this clearly would be one of the very first attempts at cloning, other than plants, of course, which would have naturally cloned themselves way beforehand. Creating cloned live-born children, sometimes called reproductive cloning, necessarily begins by creating cloned human embryos, a process which some also propose as a way to create embryos for research or as sources of cells and tissues for possible treatments of other humans. The first thing, what comes to mind in that particular case is shots. I'm pretty sure in vitro has been used to develop certain shots. The most recent shots that were heavily pushed upon everybody definitely seems to have something to do with this. The reason that I bring this up is because of the agouti gene and the agouti proteins. The agouti gene and the agouti proteins essentially determine what hair color you're going to have, what fur color, what skin color. It doesn't matter if you're an animal or a human. It's almost like a control center, in a sense, that can be tweaked within your DNA, and it is responsible. It works right along with the MC1R gene, which was one of the pathways that was mentioned during the shot time that occurred a couple years ago, where it could potentially alter your DNA by getting this shot and cure you from diseases, because it helps also produce hormones, and these hormones then help regulate various processes like hunger, your sexual drive, your moods. There's also another protein it works right along hand in hand with. There's 3 altogether. This includes the agouti signaling protein, which is a antagonist that's competitive with alpha melanocyte stimulating hormone, and this hormone then binds with melanocortin 1 receptor, which is the MC1R proteins. Because it has the ability to affect not only hormones, but this alpha melanocyte stimulating hormone and the agouti signaling protein. Together also have the ability to change the homeostasis inside of your body, or the energy levels that one may or may not have. This hormone also has the ability to affect cortisol levels within the body, which affects the heart. And if that for some reason has been altered, then it may or may not cause things such as strokes or heart attacks. Can control, the ability to clot or not clot. The Gauge signaling protein structure contains a glycoprotein, an N-terminal, and also a C-terminal, which were also mentioned heavily a couple of years ago. The prospect of creating new human life solely to be exploited and destroyed in this way has been condemned on moral grounds by many, including supporters of rights of abortion, as displaying profound disrespect for life. And recent scientific advancements with adult stem cells indicate that there are fruitful and morally unproblematic alternatives to this approach. So I do find this kind of interesting, because let's pretend you do use these stem cells or these somatic cells to start creating babies in petri dishes, and then they also mention above turning human reproduction into a manufacturing process. That would essentially mean that eventually there's going to be such a thing as baby factories, baby making factories, but that would also mean that there's going to be a potential for human clone killing factories, because if they are able to copy multiple human clones, then for whatever purpose, then in reality they could also, this is where the second-class clone citizenship comes in, that these creating new human life solely to be exploited and destroyed. That's where the ethical and moral concerns seem to be coming in. And that if you are creating a bunch of babies in a lab made out of collected DNA or sperm or eggs, or even collected DNA without your knowledge, like at a doctor's office, who knows, there's many various ways. Because what if you do have, these sperm or egg banks, or they're collecting DNA from a doctor or various other ways, and then they choose to grow them in a petri dish, but they don't put it in a woman's womb, and instead choose to grow it in a lab for like their clone army, and they make multiple copies, and if it's for like a clone army or for other medical purposes, then they could be exploited and destroyed or executed for some type of reason, which is why they would be considered second-class citizens. But you would also have to be able to identify the original from the clone by making some type of mark. But this is also highly concerning, because that's when the second-class citizenship of the clone comes into play. Because if you have this Gauge protein or DNA sequence that you can alter, you could technically, let's just say this is a political scenario, and I create a political clone of someone, or a celebrity, or it could even be a random person, and I have to be able to identify them, because what if this gets exploited and used to kill the original, so only the clone is left over. So then you could, as the government or this institution, you would already have a copy of this person's DNA, and you could make more and more copies or clones if you really wanted to. And if they are not to your specification, using this Golgi gene or protein, you could technically tweak their DNA to be a certain way. And since it controls hunger, pain, and such things, you could take away their pain. You could take away their thought. You could take away their feelings. You could take away a lot of things, or give them a lot more, make them superhuman. For all you know, it can go both ways. It doesn't necessarily have to go the other way, but if they're going to be exploited and destroyed, they probably shouldn't feel any pain or have much thought. But if you're using them for more of like a clone army purposes, they should probably be more superhuman-like. It just depends. But that is also another reason why this second-class clone citizenship becomes a moral and ethical issue, because what if someone falls in love with a clone? Or any government effort to prevent the transfer of an existing embryo or to prevent birth once the transfer has occurred would raise substantial moral, legal, and practical issues, so that it will be nearly impossible to prevent attempts at reproductive cloning once cloned human embryos are available in the laboratory. Essentially, once they've been implanted into a woman, or they've used your sperm and egg in like IVF treatments. And I believe this is also why they are allowing females and males to get IVF treatments together to essentially set up the stage for artificial wombs facilities, which they mention above, making it a manufacturing process to begin to grow clones using these collected sperm and eggs that they are collecting in now's time. I think that the women receiving IVF are partially experimental, and that is why at the top they mentioned that it is morally irresponsible and unethical, because in some cases there have been stillborn, unhealthy, or severely disabled children, and sometimes like you can see documentaries online or follow the lives of certain mothers who have received IVF treatments and have severely disabled children. And I would assume this is possibly why, because they might have selected out certain genes or altered certain genes which may or may not have caused such. It states that most places in the world ban this process, including Canada, France, and Germany, 23 other countries. The United Nations has passed a declaration calling for all human cloning to be banned by member nations. But this doesn't make any sense, because they're already doing the IVF technically. But just understand where this leads to. And I personally believe that if humanity continues, they're going to reach this stage, and there's going to be human clones everywhere. And where I mentioned earlier World War III or the Clone Wars start, is because the clones start realizing what's going on, and all the humans get tired of it, and there's those who support it and those who don't. And it creates the two different pathways, and the clones, some of the clones and some of the humans might come together to form like a alliance against these corporations or government or industries which are trying to have this in like a manufacturing like process, because giving birth and having children is technically a natural process, and right now humans still somewhat have the choice. But who says that if things continue down the path that they're going, that it will not reach such a stage? Because every time there's a new set of children inside of schools and other such areas, they, slightly change the way they think from a young age. And the way their health goes, you know, based on the medications and their environment and stuff, which is all controlled. Essentially, clones and technology are growing, and scientific advancements are growing right beside one another right now. Like, this is the time for this. In the future, you know, that they realize this, and that some of these clones and humans come together to essentially use this technology and these drones and stuff, and they program them in such a way to create then essentially the robot wars after that, the clone wars, and that then turns into the robot wars later on, because they use some of this technology to help them defeat these humans who have created this clone army, or who are part of this clone industry. Another reason that I question all of this is because, let's pretend that for some reason your DNA or your cat's DNA got sent off to the International Space Station. While there's rules about cloning and such activities here on Earth, once it reaches space and the International Space Station or other such facilities, the jurisdiction stops of any rules or laws, and I'm not sure if there has been any made about such things, but technically you could get a clone made up there and have it sent down here and you'd never know. But technically, you know, we already know that these clones are already happening here on Earth. Technically it's just the cells, but it is what it is. And if for some reason there really are clones here on Earth or on the International Space Station, you should totally let me meet my clone and my cat. I want to see my Ella. But if that is possible, I would be interested, whether I have to go up to the International Space Station and visit, or if they can come down here. But if it is possible, I would like to know personally.